Hey everybody, thanks for joining us here today. I'm super happy to welcome back Joel Wolfson. Hi Joel.
Hey Nicole, how you doing?
Good, thank you so much for being back. Joel's going to be presenting how he uses Topaz plugins to optimize images of people. So I'm super excited to have him show that. That's one of the most requested subjects we get for a webinar, so I was excited when he came to us with this idea. So let me tell you a little bit about Joel while you take a look at some of his beautiful images here. I'll get this slideshow started. There we go. Joel is published internationally, and his roster of notable clients is awesome. It includes Newsweek, Elle, 17, Houghton Mifflin, and corporate clients such as Apple, AT&T, 3M, United Airlines, and Pillsbury. His technical articles on digital imaging have been translated for use in more than 30 countries, and he has been teaching photography since 1985. He is best known, though, for his images themselves and his unexpected views of everyday places around the world. And if you're interested in learning more from Joel after this session, definitely be sure to check out his workshops at joelwolfson.com. He offers these photography and digital imaging workshops throughout the year at his studio, in his Flagstaff studio, and around the world, as well as photo guiding and private workshops. So with that, I will go ahead and turn this over to you, Joel.
Thank you, Nicole, and thanks for having me back.
Absolutely.
Welcome, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As you know from the description of the webinar, we're going to be working exclusively with people photos today. And probably more importantly, not just people photos, but the type of people photos that most of us shoot. Unless we're a commercial photographer and going on location setting up lights or doing that in the studio, most of us are just dealing with whatever conditions we have. And if you're doing street photography or candids or photos of friends and family, that's a lot of what all of us shoot. So that's what I want to concentrate on today, and I've picked some examples that I think represent that. The other thing I want to do today is to show sort of a streamline effort. Those of you that have done webinars with me before know that I'm kind of a workflow freak and I'm all about efficiency. So Topaz has a relatively new product called Photo Effects Lab, and if you saw my last webinar, I used that. And what I'm going to do today is pretty much try to use exclusively that without ever going into Photoshop. So that's kind of a neat thing. The Photo Effects Lab is kind of like a hub for plugins. The same way that Lightroom is kind of a hub for digital images. And you can see my screen here, I believe, and you can see that I have Lightroom up, and that is the software I use to organize and kind of keep track of all my images. I can keyword, I can do some of the basic adjustments I need to do. And likewise, when I have a specialized use that Topaz offers all these different plugins, and it allows us to do things sometimes a lot more efficiently and better than, say, using something like Photoshop. So I'm going to try to do all this through Photo Effects Lab. And the first image I have here is, let me go over here. That's the wrong one. There's the right one. I was showing you the after. So this is where we're starting, and this is where we want to end up. It's a fairly subtle difference, but what I'm going after here is the portrait of kind of candid shot of these older men in Italy in this little village that I found these guys that kind of meet on a regular basis. And it's pretty good the way it is, but it could use some tweaks to kind of accentuate the guys, add a little depth to it, and take some of that inherent flatness out. And the flatness comes from two things. Those of you that shoot raw images know they tend to look a little flat to begin with. And then in this particular case, I was shooting on kind of an overcast and somewhat rainy day, which that kind of lighting is actually great for people. So if you're shooting people, don't be afraid of an overcast day. It provides nice soft lighting. It's like a giant softbox in the sky, and you're not dealing with those real harsh shadows. So from that standpoint, I was happy for the overcast day. But I have the lighting that I had, and I'm going to use some plugins to kind of improve this image. Now, the way I'm going to get into Photo Effects Lab, if you have a right-click on your mouse on a Mac, or if you have a PC, you'll have a right-click. You can just right-click on the thumbnail, or you can right-click here on the image itself, and you want to scroll down to Edit In. By the way, if you have a single-click mouse, like you're on a Mac with a single-click mouse, you can do a control-click, and that gets you into this menu too. So I'm going to go to Edit In, and then the sub-menu, I want to do Edit in Photo Effects Lab, and it's first going to ask me to make a copy, and it's going to create a copy of my what is a RAW file here, a DNG, and turn it into a TIFF. And you'll see it'll kind of make a quick copy of it before we jump into Photo Effects Lab. And Photo Effects Lab, for those of you that haven't seen it before, it is a fairly familiar interface, very similar to most of the Topaz plugins, where we have presets over on the left, we have controls on the right, we have our image in the center, and those are all pretty much common to the Topaz plugins. This program adds a new dimension, and that is layers. So down here on the lower right where my cursor is, I've got layers, and even better, I can do masking with this. This is a very key thing, because layers and masking are the main reason that many photographers use Photoshop to begin with. What's cool about Photo Effects Lab is I can go into any plugin and go back and forth into Photo Effects Lab and still use layers and masking. And in addition, Photo Effects Lab has a lot of its own controls. So if you look over on the left, you notice I also have tabs. So in addition to all these presets, and those of you that don't know what a preset is, it's basically a combination of settings in the various plugins that Topaz has developed to kind of give you a quick and easy way to do various things or come up with special effects. And if you get this program, I would certainly encourage you to try some of these presets. But in addition to that, you have all these other tabs, and the main one we're going to use today is this plugin tab. And you see I have a whole bunch of plugins here, and what that will show you, if you get Photo Effects Lab or already have it, it'll show you the plugins that you already have installed on your system. So as you can see, I have quite a few. And we're just going to use a handful of those today to work on our images. So we're in Photo Effects Lab, and the first thing that I always do, and this is true if I'm in Photoshop too, is I duplicate the layer. And the way I do that is I can drag and drop it onto the duplicate, or I can just keep it selected and hit the duplicate button here. By highlighted, you see that it's in blue, and if I click on this next one down, now that one's blue, so that blue border tells you that it's selected. So you want to make sure that you have the layer that you want to work on selected before you actually work on it. So the first thing we want to do here, let me just back up a little bit. My approach with these images, and I guess it's true of most images, but particularly with portraits, before we start working on the people, I kind of look at the overall image and kind of do the global or sort of broad changes first that I want to do. So the first thing that I mentioned before about this image, it's a little on the flat side. So I'm going to go into Detail 3, which is the latest version of Detail. Before I do that, those of you that have attended my webinars before know I'm a big fan of labeling the layers. So I'm going to label it Detail 3 so that I remember later that that's the plugin I use. Additionally, I'm going to say Add Depth, because that's what I want to do with this image. And you'll see when I go into Detail 3 how I can do that. Now Detail 3 is the newest version of Detail, which just came out recently. And I'm really excited about this one because I started playing with the presets and found some presets in there that are just great, and it gives me kind of a one-step way to add depth to my images and even do some sharpening. A lot of times, actually all the time, when your images come out of your camera, they're a little bit on the soft side, so you have to kind of bring that back. And that's because they put a filter over the sensor to help eliminate color artifacts and what are called moire patterns, which are where patterns in an image interfere with the pattern in the sensor anyway. That's all geek speak, but the bottom line is that your images come out of the camera just ever so slightly soft, and you can use a program like Detail to take care of that. My favorite presets, now remember, just like all the other interfaces on the Topaz plugins, we have presets on the left. So here's a list of individual presets, and up above you can see they're divided by collections, which is kind of a nice organizational thing. If you come up with a combination of settings that you happen to like, you can use the Save button down on the bottom left here, save it, and put it in whatever collection you want. I created one here called Image Specific, so that just, to me, that just is an image that I might go back to again, and I want to apply the same settings. I have specific images in there. But I'm just going to use the preset that's in there. I don't really have to do much in here. This one called Overall Detail Light, there's 1 and 2, just adds a sense of depth to this thing. I'm going to go up in magnification just slightly so you can see. Okay, so there's before I added detail light, and take a look at this carefully because it's a subtle change, but you can see the after here. By sharpening it, we get a little bit more sense of depth. Now, if you look at the controls on the right, I could have put these controls in manually. This is just a preset that Topaz did, but I really like the combination. If you notice, the details divided into small, medium, and large, and then within those, there are 2 adjustments for each, so you can really tweak this. And then with detail 3, they've added shadows and highlights, so you can actually get specific to, let's say, increasing medium detail only in the shadows or large detail only in the highlights. It really gives you a lot of versatility. But we're on the overall here, so it's adding this level of detail, this sort of sharpening overall, and you can see most of it is medium detail. Now, I used to use a rather elaborate action in Photoshop to isolate sort of the midtones and to sharpen them up, sort of increasing mid-tone contrast, which gives you that sense of depth. Here I can do it just in one click with this Overall Detail Light 1. So that's the really the main thing that I want to do in this is just kind of this overall thing to add that depth. And since I'm pretty much done in here, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let me just magnify in just so you can see too that what it's doing to the detail. So at 100% here, there's before, there's after. Now we can see this gentleman's wrinkles a little better, and he may not like that so much, but it's definitely part of the character of his face. And so in this case, I don't mind that. If I wanted to, I could brush that back using a mask, and I'm gonna demonstrate that throughout the process. I'm going to use masks a lot in these examples. But that's another thing just to show you real quick that they've added to Detail 3. If I click on this tab, right now it's white or clear, so to speak, so everything is, the whole effect is being revealed. If I wanted, I could take a brush and block out the effect on any part of this image selectively, which is a pretty powerful thing. I'm going to do things like that, like I mentioned, but I'm going to show it to you mostly in Photo Effects Lab because that also has masking. But if you don't happen to have Photo Effects Lab, you can now do masking in detail, which is pretty cool. So we're pretty much done here. I'm going to say OK, and that's going to bring us back to Photo Effects Lab. And now I can start concentrating on a little bit more of the details in the image. One thing you notice, we've got a lot of elderly gentlemen. Some of them have lost a little hair, and so we've got some shiny foreheads. And so part of that, of course, is we have that big softbox in the sky, and these guys are acting a little bit as reflectors, some of them, so we're going to take care of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my layer. Again, the reason I keep doing multiple layers here is I want to keep a progression of steps. I'm going to relabel this one forehead. And the reason for doing all these layers is then I can go back to any one of them and reduce the effect or eliminate it or possibly change it or just delete the layer. So it just gives me a lot of options, the same way that it would in Photoshop. So what I want to do is magnify a little bit here so that we can get a look at what we want to do. So what I'm going to do is now I'm just looking at the shiny spots on these guys that are balding, and what I'm going to do is adjust the highlights down. We have a highlights control. You can see this is actually really cool. We have all these controls right from within Photo Effects Lab. So what I'm doing on this layer doesn't even require me to go into a plugin. So you see, as I bring the highlight slider down, you can see, if you look at this guy's forehead right here, you can see that diminish quite a bit, that shiny spot. And I'll bring the whites down too, and it diminishes even a little more. Same with the guy on the left here and the guy on the right. So One thing you'll notice is that it kind of goes a little gray when I do that. So what I'm going to do is up the saturation just a little bit here. Now I know it's making the image look funky, but all we really care about is the spots on the forehead for right now, and I'm going to warm it up a little bit too with the tint here. And now what I'm going to do is go to this tab in the upper right where it says masks, and right now we have the full effect revealed. I'm going to invert the mask, so it's going to make it completely black. It's going to block out everything we just did. And now the reason I do that, if for those of you that are not familiar with masks, think of it like a literal mask that you would put on your face. The mask blocks part of your face, and then where there's cutouts, it reveals your eyes or your mouth or parts of your face. So masks in Photo Effects Lab and Photoshop work the same way. Black blocks everything out entirely, and then white would reveal it completely. And if you have gray or something in between, then it just partially reveals it. So it's a pretty useful thing, and now we can selectively brush it back in. Now the brush value 0 is complete black. I'm going to move it completely to the other side, 255, which is complete white, which means full amount of the effect. We'll get a brush that's a good size here, something that's appropriate for their foreheads. So we'll bring it down a little bit. Now the flow is how fast the effect comes out of the brush. You could sort of think of it like a literal airbrush, and how fast the color comes out of the brush. But the flow, I'll just bring it down a little bit here. And the edge aware, I don't really need in this case, but that's kind of a neat way to isolate a single tone. So if I were, let's say, brushing his sweater and didn't want it to affect the bricks behind it, as long as I kept the crosshair over the sweater, it would read that tone and not go beyond it. But in this case, we don't really need that. We'll see some other examples later on where we might. I'm going to bring the brush size down just a little more. And then I can just kind of start brushing in the effect on his head. And since I have just a partial flow, the more I brush, the more the effect is. I'll take care of this guy on the left. And the guy on the right has a little bit there. And I'm not going to worry too much if I've overdone it, and I'll show you why in a second. In fact, I'm going to purposely overdo it just a little bit. I generally, when I'm making these adjustments, I generally go a little more than what I really think I'm going to need. And the reason I do that is because with layers, we can adjust it later. So if I thought that was too much, I could brush it back again by changing the brush value back to black or somewhere in between. But an even easier way is just to adjust the opacity of the layer. So I have this whole layer selected. 100% is the full effect of the layer. If I bring it back down to 0, there's no effect. So look at the spot in his head and this guy, and you can see as I go from 0 up to 100%, it brings my effect back. Now, if I overdid it a little bit, I could just back it off a tiny bit because we want it to look fairly natural. All right, so that's pretty good for the forehead issue. Now the next thing I want to do is I'm going to zoom back a little bit. So we're going to go to fit. So now let's just take a look at the overall again and see what other things we want to do. Now we've added the depth, which is the main thing we've done to it, and we've taken care of those little spots on the forehead. But the other thing is we want to accentuate our main subjects. We have this guy in the center who's dancing for us. By the way, just in terms of shooting people, you do want to try to engage folks, and groups are especially tough. So I had a group of guys, these older men, and I actually had some nice portraits of them just kind of sitting around talking and laughing and doing things with each other. But I started talking to him in my very, very limited Italian, and found out from this guy that he was a dancer, and I believe he even said he was famous. Now I don't know what that means, if he's famous in the town or in Italy or in his own mind, but in any case, he was famous, and so I asked him to demonstrate. And what that did is it gave me a central area of attention, which is him, for this portrait, this sort of candid moment here, street photography, and it got all the other guys engaged too, because they're all looking at him or laughing about it or whatever. So the guy on the left is busy with his nails, but he's still smiling at the same time. So we've kind of got everybody engaged, and it kind of gives you know, a nice environment for this portrait. So what I want to do now, just to accentuate these guys, is to lighten the faces. So I'm going to make a new layer. Now I'm going to use from stack, and the difference here is duplicate makes an exact duplicate of the layer that you're duplicating. But I have a mask in this layer, and since I want to do some other masking, I don't want that to interfere. What stack does is it takes all three of these, or however many layers you have there, and combines them, flattens them all, and creates a new one out of that. So if I do from stack, it's going to be a combination of all those, and it still gives me that, step by step where I can go back to those layers if I want to. And I'm just going to label this lighten faces. And so what we're going to do is, again, we're going to just sort of look at their faces, and I'm just going to use the exposure adjustment and bring that up quite a bit. Now, remember I said I like to overdo it a little bit. This guy, who's our center of attention, is definitely too light in the face, but this guy over here on the left has a fairly strong shadow, and his face was probably the darkest. So I'm kind of going for the most extreme here, and as we discussed before, I can always back that off. So we're going to go back into masks, and we're going to do the invert again. We have everything, the whole effect revealed right now. We're going to block it all out, and then selectively go in and brush back in their faces. So I want my brush value is okay at 255. That'll be the full effect. I want to get a decent brush size. I am going to magnify this so that we can see a little better. Maybe I'll even go a little further here so that we can see these guys' faces. I'll move it down. And the flow I'm going to back off just a little here so that we can kind of slowly brush it in. We don't want to have the effect come in too fast so that we can control it. The edge aware, again, I'm not that concerned about it. All right, so we're just going to lighten this guy up a little bit and maybe go in and do the same with these other guys. I got the guy on the left, and the two on the far left have a little bit more shadow on them, so we're going to have to brush them in just a little bit more. Go back to my brush size. And you can see I can as I keep brushing, since it's a lower flow, it's kind of a cumulative effect. And this guy, he has that dark area. I don't want to lighten it completely because we want to have a little interest, but I'm just going to kind of lighten his whole face. And let's check the guys on the far right, see how they are. They're pretty good. This guy has a hat on, so I'll probably just brush him in a little bit because you can't see his eyes very well or his face very well because of the shadow from his hat. And this other guy is pretty good, maybe just the chin and the side of his face a little bit. So now let's look at the overall. And if you notice this little eyeball on the layers down here, that turns them on and off. So if I turn it off, you can see the face lightening disappear. And when I turn it back on, you can see that's lighter. So we've gone a fairly long way now to accentuating these guys. I'm going to turn off all the layers so you can see where we started. And you can see it's still, it's a decent group portrait of these guys. The first layer right here, that's adding the depth, and we definitely have more of a feel of depth there, and the image is a little sharper and crisper. We got rid of the gleam on the foreheads there, and then we lighten up the faces. And I think the only thing left that I really want to do here is a little bit of a vignette to accentuate them a little more. So I'm going to make yet another layer from the stack here, and I'm just going to call this vignette, and I'm going to use the burn tool to do this, so I can label that just to remind me. So what I mean by that is I've got this layer. I'm going to go again up to the tabs here and go from adjustments to brushes. And in the brushes, I have the ability to do burning and dodging, adjust saturation, and adjust detail, or to sort of soften detail. And the way these sliders work, first I click which one I want, which is the burn and dodge. Now, the strength, if it's a minus value, it's going to go towards the burn. And for those of you that don't have a conventional, or I should say wet darkroom background, that's where those terms burn and dodge come from. If you think about burning toast or burning something in the oven, it turns dark. and black. So if you think of it, that's a good way to remember it. Burning makes it darker, dodging makes it lighter, and so a positive value is going to make it lighter, negative value is going to make it darker. So what I'm going to do is I want a negative value, maybe not too severe, but a little bit there. And then my brush size I actually want fairly large, because this is just going to be kind of a big sweeping thing around the image to make a vignette. And the hardness isn't all that critical, but I do want, the hardness just gives you a little feather edge just like it would in Lightroom or in Photoshop. The flow, we've talked about that before. I'm going to bring that down just a little bit because, again, I'm just looking for kind of a subtle thing. I'm just going to do these big, broad brush strokes around the edge of the image. Now, there are vignette tools in a lot of the Topaz plugins. You know, for instance, in black and white effects or Adjust, you can do vignettes. You can do vignettes in Lightroom too. But again, we're thinking about a streamlined workflow here. So instead of jumping back and forth, maybe having to go into a plugin or into another program, this is one way of doing it. It seems like with all these tools, there are always many ways to do it, but I'm just kind of trying to be efficient here and show you a way that I'm doing it. So maybe I'll just go around again and just add a little bit more of that. And it's just subtle. I don't want to eliminate this background, certainly, and I don't want to diminish it too much because it does give us the setting. All I want to do is sort of subtly take the emphasis off the background and more on the gentleman in the picture. So if I unclick that, you can see that's how it was. And when I do it this way, when you look at it, it has more the effect of just what a lot of lenses do naturally, and that is they have light fall off, especially wide-angle lenses and shooting lenses wide open, that sort of thing. So I think that pretty much completes our image. And so we'll go back into, I did this image before, and if I click OK, it takes a little computing time, so I'm going to save you guys watching the little spinning clock, and I'm just going to cancel out of here and go back into our original image, and then the one that's that we just worked on, or that's identical to the one we just worked on. And I just want to do a back and forth so you can see. So that's where we started, and that's where we ended up. Here, I'll turn off the background there. So there's where we started. You can see it's a little flat. And here we definitely have the emphasis on these guys and a little more of that depth and just kind of a nice group portrait. So there's a group one. Group ones can be a little challenging, but without explaining all this, it actually goes pretty quick, because really I was able to do almost, well, I did everything from within Photo Effects Lab, and I was able to actually do most of the effects right in there. I really only went out to detail to get that sort of magic perception of depth from those great new presets that Topaz came up with in the new version. So the next one, I shot indoors, actually just an informal shot of my daughter sleeping on her, or just getting ready to go to sleep on her mom's shoulder. And I think this one's natural for a black and white. And what I'll cover in this is we'll definitely go into black and white effects to convert it, but I'm also going to use a plugin called Clean, and of course we'll use Photo Effects Lab. What Clean does, Clean is, and I'll do that right after we get into Photo Effects Lab. Again, I'm going to do the right click, Edit in, Photo Effects Lab. Again, it's going to ask me to make a copy of it. And so it makes a copy, it brings us into Photo Effects Lab. And the first thing I want to do, of course, is duplicate my layer. And I'm going to do that. Remember, we don't want to we want to have our base original layer there all the time and just create new layers for our effects. So I'm going to use the excuse me, sorry about that, the plugin called Clean, and it's version 3. And what I'm going to use this for, and this is great for this, so whether you're doing a portrait of a baby or a model or just a friend or whatever, none of us have perfect skin. So this is a great way to kind of take blemishes out of skin and smooth it and that sort of thing. So I need to go back to my plugins here, and I'm going to go to the Clean 3 plugin. I click on Start Plugin, and it's going to take that layer, that top layer that I had selected, bring it in there. And this is a habit I like to do with all the plugins, and that is go down to the lower right where they have the Reset All, and that brings us back to a neutral starting point. Now, nothing happened when I clicked it, but if you'd been doing some work in the plugin previously, the plugin will often default to the last used settings. So this is just a way of resetting it back to your neutral point so you can kind of start from scratch essentially for that plugin and the effect that you want to do. So to get rid of the blemishes, our controls there, we could use a preset on the left. I'm gonna this time I used a preset on the other one, so this time I'll just go ahead and adjust it manually. And in this clean, you can see if you have it set this way, it's a preference. When you hover over the slider, it tells you what it does. So the strength is kind of the overall effect. The threshold, the lower the number, the more detail shows up, and the larger the number, the less detail shows up. And then the radius is sort of how many pixels it goes out. It's not going to have a big effect once you're using this. So you'll see if I go to 1, it's not going to be enough. It smooths her skin a little bit, but I can still see this blemish on her left cheek and a little bit of the redness on her right cheek. And even, babies have kind of thin skin. You can actually sort of see the veins underneath her forehead. So I'm going to go one more. 2 should probably be about right. And that's pretty good. Now I'm not going to leave it like this. We're again going to mask it out and just selectively brush in the smoothness. But I'm kind of looking at that. Poor little baby has a pimple. I'm looking at that one little mark on her left cheek there. And what I'll do is I'll just up the threshold a little bit, which means it won't see as much detail. And maybe we can go up a little with the radius. And I'm just basically looking at this one area until it's completely smooth, which it is. So I know that just looks hideous, but we're not going to use it that way. We're just going to selectively brush back in some of that. So when I say OK, it should bring us back into Photo Effects Lab. And again, we're going to use the same masking technique. So I go to the upper right, click on Masks, and do an invert. And remember, I'm inverting it because I have everything revealed now, and now I want to block everything. So that's the way it was, essentially. You can see down here in the little thumbnail of the mask, it's all black. And then I'm going to go up and set my brush value to 255. Remember, that's going to be pure white, so that's a way to brush it back in. And then I have some other parameters I can set. The main important one here is the flow. I'm going to set that up a little higher because first we're going to deal with those more obvious blemishes. And I'll blow it up here so you can see it easier. We definitely need a smaller brush for this. So I'll bring the brush size down, and we'll just go over some of these areas there. Now, when I'm using brushes, just of note here, I like to use a tablet. So if you have a tablet and you're doing brushes, you get a little more control that way. So I'm just taking out a few of these blemishes. And then what I'm going to do is go get a broader brush so that I can kind of do the rest of her face and a little bit of the forehead just in more broad strokes. I'll up the flow, decrease the flow a little bit so we don't get too much effect there. And this is just to kind of literally just to smooth out some of that redness and whatnot that we're seeing. Let me bring the brush size down for a little more of this. So, we can see every pore of the skin there. These lenses are so sharp that you see everything. And I don't want to smooth it out too much. I want it to look real. And of course, the secret of, seeing into somebody and getting across that sense of an emotion or a touching moment or something like that is it's all in the eyes. So I don't want to soften the eyes, and in fact, you'll see once we convert this to black and white, we'll work on the eyes a little bit to bring them out a little more. So now I want to prepare it for going to black and white. I'll do from stack here. And I'm just going to call this black and white prep. Now, it turns out that if you make a color image look a little bit gaudy and kind of a little overdone, too contrasty, too saturated, it usually makes for a good starting point to convert to black and white. So that's why I'm calling this black and white prep. I'll use the dynamic slider to give us a little more contrast. The dynamic slider is a lot like the adaptive exposure in Adjust and black and white effects. I'm going to add just a little saturation to this. Now, granted, when you see this, it looks a little gaudy, but we're really just going for prepping it for black and white. So I'm going to duplicate that layer, and I'm going to label this for black and white effects, and then we'll just go in and convert it. So here's black and white effects. And again, I'm going to reset all. It's a little on the flat side, so I'm going to adjust that. Mainly, we just need a little boost in contrast. So if I go into conversion, these are, again, the controls are on the right. The interface on these are very consistent. And I'm just going to use the basic exposure. And I'm just going to, all I really want to do is just up the contrast a little bit. So don't need a whole lot. And we're most of the way there. It looks great. The only thing I want to do is throw a little vignette on there. We did that with the picture of the older guys, and because I showed you how to do it in Photo Effects Lab with a brush, I'm going to use the vignette tool in here just so you see a different way to do it. The first thing I do when I'm doing a vignette is I go all the way to the minus, which makes it the darkest. Now, we're not going to use it that way, but what that does is it allows me to see these other parameters, such as the size and the curvature. So, you know, obviously we need a bigger size here. I want a little more than that. We'll take it up. Probably there would be good. And that looks good. Again, the vignette's too dark, but I'm doing this just so I can see the size of it and the shape of it. So the curvature, if I go down to 0, it's more round, and as I go all the way to the right, it's more square. I want to lean a little more towards the roundish end of things. And now I'm going to take the strength back more to where I want it. That's still a little too strong. Probably somewhere in here ought to be good. There we go. So that's a nice vignette. So we're going to say OK. And we're just about done with our black and white. I think what I'll do is I'll go into the brushes here. I'm going to create a new layer again before I do anything. And I'm just going to call this Lighten the Baby, because I just want to make her just a little bit lighter. And what we can do here is go into the burn and dodge, and now we're going to lighten, so I'm going to a positive number. And I'll put the flow at about 50%. And then all I'm doing is just kind of a just overall lightening here. So I just want her a little bit lighter to emphasize her more, a little bit like we did with the guys, the group of guys in the previous image. Bring the brush size down, and I'm going to use the edge aware here, because I'm going to work on her hands and I don't want it to spill over. So as long as you keep the crosshair on the same tone, it shouldn't spill over into the background, which is really cool. So what we're going after here is just to kind of lighten the baby in general, just so that we have the emphasis on her. Now we don't want to lose the background because that's kind of our environment. We want to see that. So we want to see that she's actually lying on her mother's shoulder. The only other thing I might see here is that we could go into the dodge mode here a little bit, and the same way whoops, that's probably a little too much. What I'm going to do here is just take a big broad brush and just take the flow down and just ever so slightly darken this background just a little more. There, I think that's just about perfect. The only other thing that we could maybe stand to do with this image is accentuate the eyes, and this is an important thing to do. You know, the eyes tell the story. So what I'm going to do is magnify so that we can see her eyes, and I'm going to use the exposure, bring it up to lighten them. Now I know we're lightening the whole thing, but we're going to mask this out just like we did before, and probably add a little contrast to the eyes too. And let's do a little sharpness as well. So, you know, it's making the whole image too light and too sharp, but we're going to selectively brush it back in using masks again. So let's get a brush size for the eyes here. And the flow is probably pretty good there, maybe 50%-ish. And I'm going to use a little bit of edge aware here, just because I don't want to go too far outside. So, whoops, I forgot to invert my mask. There we go. So I inverted the mask. We have no effect now, and I'm going to selectively brush it back in the eyes here. And if I spill over a little bit like I did, I can always brush that back out. So I can set my brush down to 0. Now if I want to see before and after, this is great with the eyeball to turn the layers on and off, and I can see where I spilled over too that way. So I can go back in. I'm going to put the flow up all the way just so I can brush out that little bit I spilled over on her eyelid here, which is too light. I think I got a little bit of spill over there too. So there we go. There's the before with the eyes, and there's the after. And what I'm going to do is let's go to the overall view so we can see the whole thing. So there's the eyes before, there's the eyes after. Now it might be a little too much. She's it may be looking a little bit unnatural, so I can just go to the opacity of this layer instead of having to manually brush in. And if I bring it down, there's nothing, just like before. And I'll probably go somewhere around there. And I think that ends up being a pretty nice black and white portrait. I am going to go out of here and do a before and after for you. So there's where we ended up, and this is where we started. So there's before. You know, it's still a nice moment. The black and white, I think, you know, really gets the essence of the feeling of this thing, and then with the combination of what we did to it with the plugins, it really accentuates it. So I see that we're running a little shy on time here. I want to have enough time for questions and answers as much as I'd like to do some more images. I think this hopefully gives you guys a good idea of a couple different kinds of portraits, or I should just say images of people that we all tend to shoot, and what we can do with the plugins to accentuate that and really get the feel of it. Just like any other image, the one thing that's really important, and this is one of the most important things I ever learned when I was first learning photography, is you want to tell a story. And it doesn't matter what the subject is, but it is especially important with people, and that is just to get across some kind of emotion or tell the story of the moment. So with that, Nicole, if you have some questions for me, I would be more than happy to answer them.
Yes, I definitely do. So let me take a look at some of those. And if you do have any more questions for Joel that you haven't already typed in, you can type them into the question module now. And we will try to get to them in the next 10 minutes or so. Also, if you didn't see my announcements, I wanted to let you know that we will be giving away a copy of Photo Effects Lab and the entire Topaz bundle to one lucky attendee in about 10 minutes or so. So be sure to stick around. And I'll also be announcing the coupon code for Joel's session that'll be good for 2 days for 30% off of everything that he's shown here today, plus all the rest of our products. So with that, let me go ahead and answer some of these questions that have been coming through. Okay. Some technical questions that came through at the very beginning. One from Ken. Joel, he says that he noticed you're editing in 240 DPI. Is that your standard for editing photos? And then is that your standard for printing photos?
Excellent question, Ken. Yes, you're correct about the printing. That 240 DPI is sort of a minimum that I use for resolution of printing, and so that I just sort of let it default to that. DPI is relative, so that 240, it's actually pixels per inch. Some people call it dots per inch. It's sort of used interchangeably, but that is relative to the size of the image. So if you have an 8 by 10 at 240, that's a smaller file than 20 by 30 at 240. But that 240 is kind of key for sort of a minimum level for printing on photographic paper. Now, if you're going to print on some of the real textured fine art papers or canvas or something like that, you can even go a little lower without diminishing the quality of the image noticeably. So it might be 180 for canvas, 240 if you're doing really high-res stuff on glossy paper, 300. I hope that answers your question, Ken.
I think it does. Thank you. Let's see here. Stuart asks, with the black and white conversion capabilities of tools like Topaz black and white effects, is there any need to shoot in black and white anymore?
Oh, I love this question because if you're shooting digitally, you're not really shooting in black and white. If you're shooting film, yes, there's a reason to shoot in black and white because that's the only way you can do it. I guess you can shoot in color and scan your images and then convert them later. So in that sense, you may be right that you don't absolutely have to shoot it in black and white. But what's cool about digital is, and I encourage this in my workshops, is even if you're shooting in RAW, generally with most cameras, if you set the JPEG setting to black and white, you'll still get a black and white preview on the back of your camera, on your screen. And the nice thing about this is this helps with the visualization process. I did a visualization webinar last time, and that's really all about seeing the image in your mind's eye before you shoot it. And learning to see in black and white is a skill that takes some practice. And if you have a digital camera and you set up the picture style for black and white, and you're set on RAW, you still get that RAW image. You can still use it in color, but it will kind of help you learn to see in black and white. In fact, when I was shooting the pictures of the guys in the little town in Italy, I had my camera set on black and white, it was set on RAW, so I was still getting color, but it was able to give me black and white previews, and that just gives me an idea right on the camera of what it might look like. So it does you kind of get the best of both worlds if you're shooting digitally.
Great. Speaking of that image of Italy, we had some people asking where that was taken in Italy.
That is in Tuscany, in a little town way, way high up on a mountain, and it's called Radicofani.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great little town if you ever get there.
I have Kevin asking if you have a favorite black and white preset. I'm not sure if you showed presets.
Yeah, I don't know if I showed the presets in there, but there is one that comes with black and white effects that I use a lot that's called Classic. Topaz has one called Neutral Grayscale, and that's usually where I start out, and then my next step is to click on Classic. And Classic gives you a pretty good conversion for most images, at least as a starting point. And that's one nice thing about the presets in general. They can often give you a good starting point, and even if it isn't exactly what you want to begin with, it gives you an idea where you want to go with it. So I would say if I had to pick a favorite preset that came with it, it would be the Classic.
Thank you. Let's see here. John, I believe it was asked, what are your top 3 favorite plugins?
It's a little bit subject dependent, but I can tell you that the ones I use the most are Adjust and black and white effects, because I do a lot of black and white. And then if I'm doing some intricate masking, I like Remask. Now, I'll have to say I've just started using the new Detail 3, and I don't know if I raved enough about the great presets in there for getting that sense of depth. But I really like there's one called, was it Detail Enhancement? There's Micro Contrast, and I think there's another one. But there are 3 really great presets in there that a lot of times I don't have to do anything after that. So I think I answered your question, John, but my go-to ones I'd say are Adjust, black and white effects, and Detail. And then the rest are going to be kind of subject dependent. And of course, like I say, for intricate masking, there's nothing. I've used a lot of different masking products, and there's nothing out there that's as good as Remask.
Okay, thanks. All right, Jim
Thanks, Jen.
asked a great question, too. He says, you said the story is important. Do you set up your shots to tell a story, or do you review your shots to see which ones do tell the story?
Oh, that's a good question. On a commercial shoot, I'm more likely to have it be a little more set up just because that's the nature of the job. But like the shot of the guys, or I don't know, is my screen still showing on?
It is, yes.
Can people still see my screen?
Mm-hmm.
So this was the other image I was going to do, the lady with the fava beans. So this is kind of this and the one with the guys with the guy dancing are sort of they're not totally candid because I was involved. And sometimes you can help along the situation and then just let people do things spontaneously. I hope I'm understanding your question correctly, but like the lady with the fava beans here, the grocer that she buys from just came by and delivered them right through her window, which is why they're sitting on her windowsill. And I sort of got her attention and asked her if I could take her picture, and she just, held up her handful of fava beans for me, and it just made a great portrait. And same thing with the guys dancing. I guess it's not really set up, but I did encourage the guy to do something spontaneous. He said he was a dancer. I go, oh, can you show me some of your dancing? And and then what I do generally is once I get the idea in somebody's head or whatever, I just sit there and let things happen. And that way you can get spontaneous expressions and just let people do their own thing. And sometimes you have to spend a little time with people before they get used to you and get used to the camera. And obviously the picture of the baby, that's just, purely a candid moment. Even if I asked Leah to do something for me, she's 5 months old and she probably wouldn't do what I asked her to do anyway. So
probably not.
And same thing when you're shooting wildlife or pets or whatever, you often have no control over what they're going to do, and you just have to pay attention and look for that moment. So I hope that answers your question about telling a story.
Yes, I think it does, and I think that's an awesome place to end this webinar. Thank you so much for showing us how you work with your images of people, Joel. I really appreciate it, and we've got some awesome feedback here as well.
Oh, great. Well, thank you, everybody. I really appreciate everybody joining us, and look forward to doing another one, and thank you also, Nicole.
All right, thanks, everybody, and have a great holiday season.